Hello, Johnny from Dicebreaker here, and today we're talking all about Magic the Gathering. The latest expansion, Theros Beyond Death, is coming very soon and looks poised to shake up one of Magic's most memorable locations. But exactly what is it? How does it tie into the lore of Magic the Gathering? And exactly how has Theros changed for this new expansion? There's plenty to talk about, so let's get right to it. This video is brought to you by Magic the Gathering. As I'm sure you'll remember, Theros is a plane heavily inspired by Greek mythology. It's a plane in which the gods are very real and very much involved in human affairs. It's divided into three realms: the world of the living, home to human mortals, Nyx, the shadowy realm of the gods, and the Underworld, the realm of the dead, governed by the grasping, whip-wielding god, Erebos. Theros then plays host to a rich cast of gods, heroes and monsters, epic tales and fierce battles, but it also introduced a number of interesting new keywords and mechanics to Magic the Gathering, including heroic, devotion and bestow. An eventful set, I think you'll agree, but now Magic the Gathering is set to return to Theros, what can we expect? Theros Beyond Death continues the story of Elspeth Tyrrell, the protagonist from the first Theros set. Elspeth was once known as Elspeth, Sun's champion, having earned the favour of the sun god Heliod. Heliod's favour was not to last, however, as Elspeth was tricked by Xenagos, a scheming satyr who managed to make himself into a god as a direct result of the sun champion's actions. Although Elspeth eventually killed Xenagos, Heliod was unwilling to forgive his former champion and struck her down with her own weapon. Kinda harsh. Now, ordinarily, it's not very easy to continue a character's story if they've already been slain by a god, but this is where the third realm of Theros comes into play. As the title suggests, Theros Beyond Death has a very heavy underworld focus, as Elspeth tries to make her escape from the realm of the dead. See, as the story goes, in Theros Beyond Death, Elspeth has been enjoying a peaceful stay in Elysia, the most tranquil part of the underworld, typically reserved for fallen heroes. Now, though, something has disturbed that rest, causing her to once again take up arms. We'll come back to that in just a moment, but first, let's check in on our protagonist, shall we? Elspeth, for her part, looks pretty badass in Theros Beyond Death. For one thing, she's earned herself an ominous new name, Elspeth, Sun's Nemesis. Where once she wore white robes, she's now clad in some pretty dark armour, and her seemingly reforged spear has definitely taken on a more sinister, wreathed in black smoke sort of vibe. I mean, listen, I'm not saying I'm glad Heliod cut down Elspeth in her prime or anything, but you have to admit the underworld aesthetic kinda suits her. To an extent, Elspeth, Sun's Nemesis, behaves much as you'd expect her to if you're familiar with her previous incarnations in Magic the Gathering, which is to say she can still summon 1/1 human soldier creature tokens. More importantly though, Elspeth, Sun's Nemesis has an escape ability. Escape is a brand new mechanic in Theros Beyond Death, and, if you ask me, it's pretty cool. Essentially, the barrier between the world and the underworld has been worn fairly thin, or, to put it another way, the dead don't always stay dead. So, if a card has Escape, as Elspeth, Sun's Nemesis has, it can be cast from the graveyard rather than the player's hand. This ability doesn't come cheap, mind you. Instead of paying the regular cost, Escape has you pay an alternate cost with two components. The first being mana, as you might expect, but the second being a number of cards you have to exile from your graveyard. In Elspeth's case, you have to exile 4 other cards from your graveyard in order to cast her. Pricey. Expensive though this alternate card cost may be, it's still pretty potent, allowing you to bring back a card that's already been taken off the table, or cast one for the first time if you're feeling a bit hamstrung by the cards currently in your hand. As well as tying the story into the mechanics in a really neat way, Escape ensures your opponent can never be certain they've seen the last of a particular card or character, which is pretty intimidating, especially when you consider some creatures come back from the Underworld stronger than they were before. Take this Underworld Ragehound, for example. It escapes with a +1/+1 token on it, which is quite horrible when you think about it. There are ways to limit the use of escape, mind you. Kunaros, Hound of Athreos, for example, prevents players from casting spells from their graveyards, rendering all escape abilities completely useless until the card is dealt with. Clever dog. As exciting as Escape is, however, it's not the only way Theros Beyond Death is playing around with Magic the Gathering mechanics. Devotion, Constellation, and Sagas all make a return for Theros Beyond Death. Devotion, you may remember, is a rating that increases with the number of permanents you have in play of the corresponding colour. That rating can be used to provide different effects on cards. Take Caliphate, Beloved of the Sea, for example. As you can see here, her power rating increases in accordance with your devotion to blue. Constellation, meanwhile, is a returning ability word that's used to refer to abilities that trigger whenever an enchantment enters the battlefield under your control. For example, Favoured of Ioris has an enchantment ability that grants them double strike until the end of the turn every time an enchantment comes into the battlefield under your control. Sagas, meanwhile, are cards with a varying number of chapters on them. These abilities tend to play out one per turn until the story is complete, at which point the card is sacrificed. Sagas enter the battlefield with a lore counter on them, gaining an additional counter during each of your pre-combat phases, i.e. just after you draw for the turn. Anytime a saga gets a lore counter, the ability from the corresponding chapter is triggered. Theros Beyond Death is, of course, inspired by Greek mythology, so, as you might expect, some of the sagas are pretty epic. Like this one, for example, Elspeth Conquers Death, which, in its final chapter, allows you to return a target creature or planeswalker from your graveyard to the battlefield with a +1/+1 counter on it. Not too shabby. So that's how protagonist Elspeth is doing in Theros Beyond Death, as well as a brief explanation of the new and returning mechanics. But what about that mysterious something I mentioned was disturbing Elspeth's rest earlier on? Well, if you keep your eyes peeled in the official cinematic, that mysterious something is almost certainly Ashiok, Nightmare Muse, a planeswalker who enjoyed a nefarious subplot in the original Theros expansion. In Theros Beyond Death, they seem more powerful than ever, spreading nightmares throughout the realm of Theros. Not even the Underworld is immune to their corrupting influence, and, worse still, Ashiok seems to be focusing a great deal of their energy on Elspeth, whose twisted memories they apparently find delicious. Looking at the card itself, Ashiok certainly seems like a formidable opponent. The lowest ability on this card enables its owner to cast up to 3 face-up cards from their opponent's exiles without paying their mana costs. Effectively, what this means is that by using the escape mechanic, opponents are effectively fueling Ashiok's abilities, letting them wreak some serious havoc and, overall, making escape an even riskier thing to use. Worse still, Ashiok can create a nightmare creature token that forces opponents to exile the top 2 cards of their library every time it attacks or blocks, meaning not even the most cautious players are safe from Ashiok's influence. Frankly, with this Nightmare Muse showing up, it's no wonder Elspeth is keen to break out of the Underworld. Oh, and did I mention the gods themselves are at war? Because the gods themselves are at war. Like I say, there's a lot going on in Theros Beyond Death. Now, as you might imagine, the gods being at war isn't exactly brilliant for Theros, introducing a fair amount of chaos to the Underworld and beyond. And if you don't believe me, just have a peek at the art for this card, Underworld Breach, which depicts civilians and warriors alike reacting in terror as the Underworld itself spews forth a torrent of fire and monstrous creatures. Worse yet, for those unfortunate mortals, this card gives every non-land card in its caster's graveyard the escape ability, meaning, at least for a time, pretty much any card could return on that player's turn, a potentially devastating ability. I don't know about you, but I really don't fancy this spearman's chances. Still, one man's horrible demise is another man's crowning glory, and sure enough, while some of Theros' inhabitants are being brutally slain, others are absolutely thriving. See, the gods of Theros have chosen champions from among the mortals, and these heroes make appearances of their own as cards in the set. Anax, hardened in the Forge, for example, is the champion of the god Porphyros, a demigod who thinks of nothing but martial victory. Heliod, the sun god who struck down Elspeth, meanwhile, has restored and empowered Daxos to fight in his name, which, when you consider Daxos was Elspeth's former lover, is kind of a jerk move. I don't want to speak ill of the sun god or anything, but I'm really starting to think this Heliod guy is just a little bit petty. Anyway, that, my friends, is a very brief overview of what Theros is, how it's changed for Theros Beyond Death, and some of the mechanics you can expect from this latest set. To recap briefly, Elspeth is dead, Ashiok is causing trouble even in the Underworld, so Elspeth is saddling up in order to put a stop to it. Meanwhile, the veil between the Underworld and the world of the mortals has worn thin, the gods are at each other's throats, and generally speaking, everybody in Theros is gearing up for an almighty scrap. Escape is the brand new mechanic for this set, while Devotion, Constellation and Sagas make a welcome return. If you're looking to join the fight, you don't have too long to wait. Theros Beyond Death launches in Magic the Gathering Arena on the 16th of January 2020, then it hits stores just a few days later on the 24th. Don't forget, of course, that Magic the Gathering Arena is entirely free to download. And that about does it from me. Hopefully you enjoyed this video. If you did, there are plenty more from Dicebreaker for you to watch. Some of them should be on screen now. Do like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you don't miss anything else from Dicebreaker. But most importantly, thank you very much for watching, and have a lovely day.